Welcome to the number one podcast covering Michigan State basketball. The Final Four is not on the schedule. Join Rod and me, Eric, as we dive deep into the Spartans to get you prepared for every game. Subscribe today for in-depth recruiting updates and fantastic interviews with today's important college basketball personalities like Robbie Hummel.
Thanks for having me. I have listened to your guys' podcast numerous times on drives throughout any Midwestern Big Ten city. So I am big fans of your guys' work.
Jay Billis.
And next time, hey, if anybody in Michigan wants a December tea time, call me. You wimps won't show up, but I'll be there. I'll be there and play in the cold. And Izzo will be in front of the fire with hot chocolate.
Coaches Thomas Kelly.
No problem. Glad to be back, man. Glad to be back.
Mike Garland.
You just can't sit there and trade twos for threes. You can't do it. You're going to lose. Coming down the stretch, you're going to lose.
And more. You won't find better coverage of Spartan hoops than you will get here. For both the casual and hardcore fan, come along as we take you for a green and white ride. Hey everybody, it's Eric alongside Rod, here with a little news about the coaching staff at Michigan State. Before we start, I want to alert those of you who are supporting listeners that I will be sending out an invite to your email regarding RSVPing for the in-person dinner in July. Be sure to check your spam folders in case it doesn't show up in your regular email box. I'll need to get pretty hard numbers probably a few weeks before the event in July, so make sure you be on the lookout for that and can respond quickly. And as always, if you'd like to support the show, you can head on over to tffinots.com/support. To find ways to do it on a one-time or recurring basis. It's also a place to connect with the sponsor of our show. All right, Rod. So a few weeks ago, we discussed potential replacements for assistant coaches after the exit of Mark Montgomery. Montgomery headed over to take on the head coaching position at UD Mercy, and a program that has only one direction could possibly go, which is up after a disastrous season where I think they only won a few games. And so the hiring of Saddi Washington, who was an assistant at University of Michigan for 8 seasons under both coaches Beeline and Howard, was one of the worst kept secrets in the Midwest. He was seen traveling with Izzo on recruiting and scouting trips, but it was made official today as we're recording this on June 6th, although this recording is going to come out a little bit later. So Saddi's the guy, and it's I think who we sort of, when we talked about it, that was our guess, is that it'd be him.
Yeah, and certainly, as you mentioned, he was spotted at an EYBL session in Indianapolis, sitting with Izzo during a game, at least one game, maybe more. And that was kind of a tell, in addition to everything else. There was a point that there were rumors circulating that it might be Tum Nairn, but you kind of knew that wasn't in the cards when two things happened. One was spotting Saddi. The other was Tum got he got an
elevation in position, right, to associate.
An elevation in position, yeah. He got promotion to, I believe, to associate head coach, I think. But regardless, it's clearly defined as the lead assistant position under Todd Simon. And so that was, you're not going to do that if the guy's going to leave.
Right.
So that came maybe a week and a half ago. And from what I understand, the announcement of Saddi had to do with contractual issues with Michigan. Yeah. That his contract was actually slated to expire at the end of May. So technically he was not free to take the job at Michigan State. That was my understanding until that expired. And so that's the story as to why it played out the way it did. But as you mentioned, he was somebody that we were talking about, it must have been back in April, right?
I think so, yeah. In April,
when Mark Montgomery took the U of D job. And it made sense. First of all, he was available. He was not going to be part of Dusty May's staff. And so he was on the market looking for a job. He's somebody that Tom Izzo knows extremely well. Izzo, in the announcement today, mentioned he's known him since his junior year of high school at Lansing Sexton. So that's a long time, because Saddi's been coaching for 18 years. And that's after he had a bit of a pro career overseas. So they've known each other a long time. He's a Lansing kid, as I say, played at Sexton. His father, Stan Washington, was a Michigan State player in the 60s. He's definitely one of the best MSU players of that era. He's a name that maybe doesn't get remembered as much today, as he probably merits in the all-time Michigan State great annals. But he was definitely one of the best players of that 50s and 60s period for Michigan State. So he's a Lancey guy, and there's Spartan blood running through his veins. That's the way I look at it, which should be enough for fans to kind of get past the Michigan thing.
Right.
And I believe, if I remember correctly, he actually interviewed for a job at least once at Michigan State prior to taking the Michigan job, because he had a pretty long run. I believe he was a grad assistant at his alma mater, Western Michigan, for like a year. And then he had a fairly long run. I want to say it was 8 years, 10 years, something like that, with Greg Campy at Oakland. Yeah. And so it was during that period when he was at Oakland that I think he was a candidate at least once in a coaching search. And I honestly, I'm drawing a blank on which one it would have been. But I know he was a candidate. Might have even been the year Dane Fife got hired. That could be, which I think was 2011.
Could be, yeah.
But in any event, so he's been in the mix before. Somebody has a long track record with, even though he's never been part of the Michigan State program. But I think when you look at it, there was some speculation that, well, maybe this is the time to get young blood, not just fresh blood, but young blood. And so that's why you would see support for the idea of somebody like Tom.
Sure.
Or somebody like Chris Fowler, who played at Central, was a grad assistant at Michigan State. His brother played football at Michigan State, Benny Fowler, and he's currently, I believe, is on DJ Stevens' staff at Western Michigan. So he was another name that was in that mix too. And Izzo could have gone that route, but I think what this indicates is he wanted somebody that was maybe a little more of an experienced hand that he had familiarity with, but then at the same time is coming from outside the program. So for those who like to toss around some of my least favorite words like stale and stubborn, you're getting somebody who's coming in from outside the Izzo tree.
Mm-hmm.
in Saddi Washington. He's completely outside of it, yet is been in close enough proximity to it that he's a known quantity.
Right.
So that's a tough tightrope to walk, but it happens to be the case here in my view. I happen to think that all the stuff about fresh eyes and all that is mostly nonsense. Tom Izzo is not hiring someone, in my opinion, to come in and say, tell me all the ways in which I'm not getting it done right. That's not the idea. He's hiring someone he thinks he can trust help him accomplish what he wants to accomplish. Now, could that mean some fresh thoughts in certain areas? Yeah, I'm sure there will be. But so much of this stuff gets into fantasy land. It's just not how it is. He's not going to hire somebody to come in and reinvent the way Michigan State approaches basketball. That's just not on the cards.
Right.
Why he's in the Hall of Fame. Why would he? I mean, just some of the stuff it's just so stupid. That's the only word for it. It's just stupid.
Yeah.
People don't use their heads. They don't pay attention, or in some instances, they don't know what they don't know. But no, it's nothing that extreme. I think what we're talking about here is a guy that was a known quantity that he feels fits what he wants in his program, and someone that he feels he can trust. He can trust in talent identification. He can trust in player development, all those things.
Yeah.
That's why you hire him.
And someone certainly you can recruit with, right? I mean, I think there's no question that he was involved in a lot of recruiting in Michigan, and he was very effective there. And I mean, a guy who can stay on two staffs, that's an unusual person. So that's someone who obviously is valued by a coach, right?
The fact that what you're referring to is the fact that he was on the staff under John Beeline for a while, and then he stayed on the staff when Juwan Howard came in. And I think that's a very good point. And I believe he was the one holdover, right?
I
from that
think
staff.
so.
So, yeah, that is impressive. It's interesting with the recruiting stuff. There's a couple thoughts on that. First of all, college, for the 9,043rd time, college basketball is not college football. In college football, assistants really are, in many instances, key figures in recruitment. In basketball, it's not really that way. My understanding, things I've always been told and observed as I've watched this stuff unfold, is that assistants can be table setters. Like, they have their own relationships, so they might be able to get the program in the door, but certainly in a program like Michigan State's, Tom Izzo is going to be the guy to close that recruitment or not. You're not asking, it's again, fantasist thinking to believe that, well, an assistant's going to come in and they're just going to change the trajectory of recruiting in a fundamental way by themselves. And I'm not saying that there are many people out there claiming this about Washington, but, sometimes people let these flights of fancy get to them, and it's just not how it is. Like, I'll give you an example. So Doug Wojcik has been very instrumental, I would say, in Michigan State's recent uptick in recruiting. And some of that has been by virtue of the relationships that he has with certain people, certain AAU programs, et cetera, which have gotten Michigan State off to an early start. That's where it helps. Okay, you've got an assistant who has relationships with people who can tip them off early to a player, which means you can get in the door recruiting that player maybe before a lot of the competition is even aware they exist. That's helpful. And setting the table for the head coach to come in. But, it's still the head coach. So I think Saddi certainly won't be a negative, but I don't know that I believe that he's all of a sudden going to be a game changer as a recruiter. I think he'll be fine. I would anticipate he'll be good. He has his own network of contacts. Maybe that means that Michigan State is recruiting in an area where they haven't had much activity before. We've seen that since John Borovich came on board.
Yeah.
Which we should also note, by the way, something we haven't talked about. There's a new NCAA rule. You can actually have 5 assistants now. So Borovich and Austin Thornton are now, as of today, officially assistant coaches.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Okay.
Now, you could still only have 3 guys out on the road, but you can have 5 full-fledged assistants. So Michigan State has their 5. So in any event, that's kind of where I sit in the recruiting thing with Saddi, is that I think he'll be fine, and maybe there'll be, the occasional guy here or there that they get in on because of relationships that he has, but it's still the only exception to that was always you did have programs where a certain assistant might be there because
the bag man.
He was a bag man. He was tapped into a particular AAU program, both that kind of thing. But generally speaking, it's not even just a Michigan State thing. It's most places. The head coach is the guy who wins and loses recruitments. It's not football.
Yeah, it's always a relationships thing for all recruiting. It always has to be. And so obviously the more relationships you have, the closer they are, the more important, the more helpful it is. You just don't need as many, as you pointed out. You don't have to, as an assistant coach, you're only recruiting at most 15 players at a time. That's like a couple years in advance.
That would be a lot. That would be a lot.
How many years you're looking 3 years in advance or something like that. So there aren't that many people you're going to evaluate. Obviously, hopes to have more coaches go out so you can have them go to different places if the head coach can only be one place at once. But you're augmenting, maybe, or slightly detracting from the head coach in general, right? Outside of the rare instance, like with Beeline, where he brought in a defensive specialist, said, I'm just going to hand this over to you. Yeah, it's really just someone who's going to be able to be that second person closing a deal, right? Or being, having a relationship with the family or something like that.
Yeah, it's as I say, it's something that can maybe get you into the game early. And it's also, and this is where the trust comes in, it's talent identification. Sure. So the head coach can only do so much at any given time. So you do need your assistants to cover that ground. You need an assistant to go, off the shoe circuit and see somebody they've heard about.
Right.
And the head coach needs to be able to rely on that assistant's evaluation. So that's where, again, the trust factor comes into play. You need to believe that that guy knows. I saw a great quote today. I think it was from Seth Greenberg, and he was talking about the role of assistants. It was in the context of the Danny Hurley story. At least the day we're recording this, there's strong speculation Danny Hurley may take the Lakers' job. And Greenberg was talking. He made this comment about how, he would expect UConn would stay in house and promote one of their top two assistants to replace Hurley if Hurley left. And he was saying, those guys as assistants, their primary job is beyond just the coaching and development, that stuff, is to be a guy the coach can trust to know who can play for that coach.
Yeah.
So that's where it's not even just talent identification, it's identification, period. To have an idea, well, this kid might be able to play, but personality-wise, he'd never be able to hold up to the way Izzo coaches.
Yeah.
Or his body language and mentality would drive Izzo crazy. To know those kind of things. Or to say, this guy might not be obviously fully there as a talent, but he plays so hard and his mentality is such that Izzo's going to love it. Those kinds of things, that's very important. And so that's where I think that trust factor comes into play, that you want guys you believe can be your eyes and ears, and know what they're looking at and know whether it makes sense to then invest the resources of getting the head coach.
Right, because you got to fly around. Like you said, if nothing else, there's a lot of time that goes into it outside of just the expense of flying private everywhere. To
Absolutely.
Go see players. I think one of the...
I'll tell you this, too. You don't want to be, and it's funny, in Judd's book, I believe he references this a handful of times. What you don't want to be as an assistant coach is a guy who says to your head coach, hey, you need to see this kid. And the head coach goes and sees and says, what the hell were you talking about?
Right.
This kid can't play for us. You don't want to be there. So it's got to go both ways. There's got to be a synergy there.
One of the interesting things about this hire, too, is, you have, when we always talk about the succession from Izzo when he retires, whenever that might be, whether it's 5 years from now, 10, who knows, whenever. And our expectation is that Izzo will be highly involved in that unless something happens, and he can't be. And so he's going to probably, for the most part, pick his successor. And that's going to come from someone he knows intimately that can, lead the program and have the same values and cultural values that he that he cares about.
Yeah.
And so, obviously like Drew Valentine, Tum Tum Nair, these are, names bandied about. But adding Washington now is someone who wouldn't have been on that list. But now that he's going to be an assistant, presumably for a few years at Michigan State, he will immediately become a candidate if things work out. I mean, right? He's going to be someone who now will be in the mix, and it just adds one other name, someone with experience who potentially could be a successor.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Yeah, you'd be foolish to rule it out. Because once you're in that tree, and he is now, you become, I think, a more logical candidate for the job. But I think it's very premature.
Oh, sure.
To think. I'm not criticizing you. Just I'm glad you brought it up. I've seen people on social media talking in that way, and look, there's something missing in that equation for Saddi Washington that you otherwise would like to have, and that's he will have no head coaching experience. Now, Tom Izzo didn't have it either, so I don't think that necessarily rules somebody out. But let's be honest, most likely that would be the equation. It seems unlikely that Saddi would coach at Michigan State, have time to then get a head coaching job somewhere else, and be in the mix to replace Izzo. There's probably not enough years left.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe Izzo will surprise us, but there's probably, you would assume there's not enough years for all that to unfold. So then the likely path would be assistant to head coach. And let's keep in mind, Doug Wojcik just got promoted today to associate head coach. So Saddi isn't even It's not like he came in as the number one assistant.
Right. Yeah.
He's not.
And it's probably
in the pecking order.
It's probably fair to say too that he wasn't hired with the thought that he might be a successor. I mean, maybe in the back of your mind, it's like number 10 on the list or something. But I think he knew he's going to bring in is someone who could potentially take over for him. That's the only reason to hire anybody is that he thinks that they have they have this whatever it is that he needs and that would do the job.
But beyond that, that's as far as it goes. Yeah, if you're taking this as some kind of signal that, well, Izzo's trying to find his coach in waiting, come on.
Yeah.
That's not what's going on here. He hired Saddi Washington because he thinks he's the guy most capable of giving him what he thinks he needs as an assistant. That's why he got hired. But at the same time, I wouldn't say, well, no, that's foolish. Of course he could be in that mix. We don't know where things are going to go. DJ Stevens has not had a bang-up start at Western. I wish I could say otherwise. I really do. But that hasn't happened for him yet. So hopefully he's going to be able to get that turned around, and because I think that's probably what's going to be necessary to make him a viable candidate now. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Drew Valentine. Look, 2 out of 3 years at Loyola, very, very good. He's got to keep that going. His recruiting suggests that he's going to have a shot to do that. But he needs to keep doing it to be in that position when the time comes. But that's a distinct possibility. You mentioned Tom. No way of knowing when Izzo, if Izzo coaches another 5 years, Tom might have an opportunity to be a head coach somewhere.
Yeah. Maybe Bowling Green, they're successful. The head coach leaves, he takes over.
Or he may end up on the staff at Michigan State before Izzo's done. Yeah. That's also possible. So there's, we mentioned Chris Fowler. Who knows what goes on with his career? I mean, there are guys right now. It's just at the moment, the one guy you feel most excited about would probably be Drew Valentine because, he's actually done it as a head coach.
Yeah.
And he's done it successfully.
And he's young too.
Yeah, and he's exactly that shouldn't be discounted either. I mean, he's a guy who's, I believe, still in his early 30s, maybe mid-30s now, but definitely south of 40. So that's a factor also. But yeah, I mean, bringing it back around to Saddi, you can't dismiss that possibility. We just have to see how things go. I mean, we're all assuming that this is a wonderful partnership, and it probably will be. I have no reason to expect it won't. But, you never know until guys are in there working together as to what that relationship is going to be between he and Izzo. I would expect it to be very good because, again, Izzo's not, casting this net and hiring like, for example, what Dusty May's done at Michigan. It's an approach, but it's an unusual one in that he's hired guys for his staff that he doesn't really have pre-existing relationships with.
Yeah.
Some of them. So, that's interesting. Like, okay, you can think it's going to work, but you're really not working from an educated position. That's not the case here. So the odds are pretty good that all the parties involved know exactly what this is going to be like.
Right.
And it also helps that Saddi Washington coached under at least Greg Campy and John Beeline, two guys who, although their styles aren't exactly like Izzo's by any means, they are demanding coaches. So he's used to that kind of, in a very general sense, that kind of environment.
And people who can give references to Izzo too. Like, I'm sure he talks about those guys and finds out what they think.
Sure.
Right. So.
Sure. Yeah, for sure.
We'll take a little bit of business here. If you're an adult, and most of us listening to this are, it's important that you do some things every day. Make sure frequently, make sure you pay your taxes, make sure you shower regularly so you have friends and so you don't go to prison. But also something else you need to change your oil, take care of your car, so you to and from work all the time. Make sure you can pay your taxes. So make sure you go to the right place to get your oil changed. That's Christian Brothers Automotive in Grand Rapids area. There are 4 locations. They have a special right now. If you mention Hoops, you get $40 off your oil change. Instead of $99.99, it's $59.99. That also comes with a tire rotation and a free courtesy inspection. They do fantastic work. It's a great place to work. If you're looking for a job too, it's a great place. My foster son works there, and he really enjoys it there a lot, and they are honest, which is why he likes working there. They're not crooked like he talks about other places. I can't tell you all the stories that he's mentioned of people who have their friends do their brake job, and they said, yep, everything was great, but my friend said he had these extra bolts. Let me tell you, if someone has extra parts after they fix your car, make sure you find someone else to fix your car. That's probably not the right person to be doing a job. Also, you can find out that at the support page at tfffinanceTS.com/support to find your locations for Christian Brothers Automotive. And again, that's hoops to get $40 off an oil change. Also, if your windows are looking a little grimy, make sure you contact the Squeegee Squad of Grand Rapids. They do fantastic work. They'll clean your house. They'll clean your windows, inside, outside, the shutters, whatever, the eaves. They will do excellent work, meticulous, super friendly people. Great price. They get 15% off. You mentioned Final Four when you get your estimate. Again, you can go to the support page to find information about that. So Rod, one of the other questions people always have with
I gotta stop you there first. Are we imprisoning people for not taking showers?
No, I'm just saying if you don't pay your taxes, you go to prison. Right. If you don't shower, you might not have friends. So those are two things you have to do in life.
Well, there was something. I'm positive there's something in there after the showering about being sentenced to prison. I just wondered if there was a new law enacted I wasn't aware of.
You can do about anything and not go to prison nowadays. So I suppose.
All right, fair enough.
So I guess, one of the things people always talk about with Saddi and in general, right? Like the big problem is that the fives are, if we only had better coach, Dwight Stevens left and it's all gone downhill since he's left, and the five, which I think, is more just the player itself than anything. I'm coaching certainly in development is a real thing, but anyway, that aside, Saddi, I think, was a coach for the big men. I think the wings is kind of what his assignment was, defensive guy, but again, I think these jobs are sort of amorphous, or I don't know what the right term is for assistants.
No, you're that there's overlap in assignments to some extent. Yeah, I think that's accurate. Again, it's not football,
right? Yeah,
you don't have. Yes, there is such a thing as, well, this guy works primarily with guards and this guy primarily works with post players, but if you're thinking about it in terms of, well, that's equivalent to a linebacker coach, no, that's not how it works typically. I do think this: if people are speculating that Saddi Washington is going to come in and be the primary guy working with MSU post players rather than Doug Wojcik, that very well could end up being the case. It wouldn't be surprising at all. But I also don't think Saddi Washington has a magic wand. And it's a much more complicated, the idea that whatever MSU's issues have been with post players, that you lay that at the feet of Doug Wojcik exclusively is ludicrous to me.
Yes.
There's a lot of explanations,
no one complains about assistant coaches with point guard play when it was bad. And they don't say, they lost the assistant coach and now their point guards aren't going to be any good at Michigan State. All the way back to the 90s. I don't think that's really the issue, right?
Right. And there's also, look, you could say, well, Mady Sissoko was a top 50 recruit. He didn't really ever firmly develop into the kind of player that they hoped he could be. Fair enough. But you know what? He's not the first guy at Michigan State with that kind of ranking at that position to not pan out. Tom Herzog was a top 50 guy, and he never panned out. He played far less of a role than Mady ever did in terms of his impact. There are other examples of that. If we're expanding it out a little bit, we're talking about post players. I mean, Marquise Gray was a McDonald's All-American. He was an elite recruit as a power forward who never really translated into an impact guy. My point here is, particularly when you're talking about big men, it is a crapshoot. It really is. And once you get outside the obvious guys, you've got a handful of top guys who usually are in any given class are going to be no-brainers. But there are very, very few of those. Once you get past them, it's a crapshoot. I mean, look at where somebody like Mady was ranked versus where somebody like Zach Edey was ranked. Right. Yeah. And that is not a totally uncommon thing. That's an extreme example, but that kind of thing, directionally at least, is not uncommon when you're talking about big kids. So I don't put that necessarily on Michigan State coaching. It might be, and I'm sure it's a factor, but there are lots of other things that go into that. With Carson Cooper, well, Carson Cooper was a guy that was seen as very much a developmental guy when they recruited him. And I think you could argue that relative to where he was coming out of high school, he's done decently.
Yeah.
You know, he hasn't become a star yet, but he's become a guy that's a contributor, and certainly defensively is a guy I think you can win with. So is that a failure? A coaching failure? I don't know. Jackson Kohler got hurt last year. He missed more than half the season, right?
Yeah.
Are we going to hold Doug Wojcik? I mean, that's the thing. I'm not saying you absolve him of all sins, but it's about more than that. It's about all the coaching staff, for starters, not just one guy. It's about talent identification. Did you recruit the right guys when it came time to make offers? You know, were there other better players available? Would have ended up being more productive for you. It's about how badly the player wants it. What is the player working on in the offseason to get better? You know, I've heard this many, many times over the years, that people give way too much credit and way too much blame for development issues with college basketball players, because the fact is, by NCAA rule, coaches are limited in terms of how much time they can spend in the offseason with players. And the offseason is generally where the gains get made. You know, you can make improvement between October and March, but, you know, it's April through September that the big work is generally done. And so that's going to fall primarily on the player. You know, so my only point in that is it's a very complicated picture with a lot of potential contributors when you're trying to sort out what makes a player effective or ineffective. And it's not as simplistic as I feel like a certain subset of Michigan State fan base wanted to make it this year. I think it's mostly born out of I would say some of it's born out of ignorance and some of it's born out of
frustration.
Knee-jerk frustration. Yeah, knee-jerk frustration in particular, that this season's been very disappointing. Somebody must be at fault.
Scapegoat somewhere.
Who's at fault? Yeah. And I think that, you know, so in any event, none of that is to say that Michigan State won't or should shuffle responsibilities. That's something that frequently happens when you have a staff addition, you know. And you could look at it as easily and say, well, Saddi's primarily worked with bigs. Makes sense to put him there. And Doug is now associate head coach. So he's on a little bit of a different role where maybe it's more like Izzo, where he's taking a more global perspective on the roster.
Right.
That's entirely possible in terms of how this works out. But let's put it this way. If Mark Montgomery had not taken the U of D job, do I believe that Doug Wojcik would have been fired to make way for Saddi Washington? No, I do not.
Chance, yeah.
And that's really ultimately what this comes down to, right?
Yeah. Well, I think so.
Yeah. I don't believe this was perceived as we got to get another guy who can coach bigs.
No,
it happened that the guy who's the best fit for the job that was available is someone who has some experience there. I don't believe that's what drove the decision. I don't have to get to that to see a reason why you'd hire Saddi Washington over some other guys.
Yeah. Well, and I have no reason to think that he's super special when it comes to, I mean, might be, I have no idea, but you know, Michigan had some good players, but
Michigan,
Dickinson was good when he came in as a freshman. It's not like, you know, it was all because of Saddi Washington.
Yeah. And you think, right. And you think about, you know, there were guys certainly in the Beeline era when he was coaching that developed. John Teskey became a pretty good big. I don't recall if he was there. I don't think he was necessarily when Jordan Morgan was on the team. Maybe he was, like, at the tail end. But Mo Wagner, I mean, there were guys that were good, that were capable players, but there were also guys on that team that they had high hopes for. There was that kid, Ricky Doyle, played there, seen as a guy with potential, and he washed out, ended up transferring. I mean, like at every other program, they weren't all success stories. So we'll see. I mean, again, I don't think I'm not trying to pour cold water on the idea that, yeah, he could end up being pretty good, and he could end up being a guy who can help Michigan State's big men in some ways. But I just don't look at it as how we had to get a fixer in here. We had to get a super specialist
right,
big man coach. And, I just don't believe that.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like the associate coach, they mainly are in charge of the minute distribution, aren't they? Like during the game. That seems like that's
Doug.
That was Stevens.
That was DJ's. It's the top assistant.
Yeah. So Montgomery was last year,
yep.
Right? I think in the last couple of years.
Was he or was Wojcik?
I don't know. I feel like Montgomery stood up and yelled at players a lot more than Wojcik did. But
could be. Could be. There's always in Michigan State system, there is always one guy who's in charge of rotations, who's in charge of substitutions. Yeah.
Because that was always the complaint about Stevens. Like these minutes, they have weird lineups all the time and they're trying to, distribute. And
that's the thing. Yeah. And that's why some of these complaints about the staff is I can go back and find, Dwayne Stevens, who's probably, I would say, over the course of time, been about as instrumental as anybody on Tom Izzo's staffs over the years. Certainly in terms of long-term success. And there were tons of complaints about him.
Oh, yeah.
People forget that, and so I just, like I was saying on a different subject, but the same thing applies. Coaches get, in a lot of ways, get too much credit and too much blame all at the same time.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Just a reminder to all listeners, it is rainy season. It's still spring. Make sure you have your gutters taken care of. If you want to make sure you don't have leaves in your gutters at the end of the fall, get the gutter guards on now. You can also, they can put the the under roof. I'm trying to remember the term for it right now, but they can put a roof underneath your deck. Oh, it's an underdeck. That, of course, is what an underdeck ceiling. They can put that on there so you can add almost like an extra room outdoors to your house. So you can put that in to keep it dry, which is very nice. So you can actually sit outside as long as you got something for mosquitoes, I suppose. But make sure if you need gutter work, the Brothers Adjust Your Gutters should be your first call. 10% off. You mentioned Final Four. East side, west side of the state. They'll go about anywhere. They do great work. And again, they replace, repair, or clean it out. They can take care of it. And Nudge Printing for all your Spartan apparel needs, whether it's football, basketball, vintage stuff, current stuff, maybe other schools in the state of Michigan. Nudge Printing can do it 20% off if you type in Final Four just as one word into the checkout. They have great stuff. And like I mentioned before, my daughter's going to Michigan State this fall, so I got to get her some Michigan State stuff since she doesn't have too much. She's outgrown her stuff from the kids. All right, so I guess until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.